The marble was cold enough to bite through silk. I pressed my spine against it, the intricate lace of my wedding gown suddenly feeling less like couture and more like a shroud, ornate and suffocating. My fingers found purchase in the beading at my waist, clutching hard enough that I felt the tiny pearls dig into my palms through my gloves. Just beyond the heavy oak door, voices drifted like smoke, casual and businesslike, discussing territories and alliances and the Rossi family's encroachment on shipping lanes I'd never heard of until my father signed my life away. And then I heard it. 5 words that turned my blood to ice. I don't want her. I never did. Victor's voice. Deep, controlled, utterly devoid of doubt or hesitation. The voice of a man stating a fact as mundane as the weather, as unremarkable as the cost of bullets or the going rate for bribes. I don't want her. I never did. 5 words, and suddenly the floor felt unsteady beneath my feet, the cathedral train of my dress an anchor dragging me down into something dark and airless. I'd known this wasn't a love match. I'd known from the moment my father called me into his study 6 weeks ago, his expression grave, his words careful, that this marriage was a transaction. The Bellinis needed the Salvatore protection. The Salvatores needed the Bellini ports. I was the signature on the contract, the seal on the deal, the living breathing collateral that made it all legally binding. But some foolish part of me, some naive corner of my heart that had survived 24 years in this world, had hoped. Hoped that maybe Victor would see me as more than a means to an end. Hoped that mutual respect could grow into something warmer, something survivable. Hoped that I wouldn't spend the rest of my life as a ghost in my own home, a strategic acquisition gathering dust in the East Wing. Then why go through with it? Bruno asked, his tone genuinely curious, as if he were asking about a bad investment Victor was stubbornly holding on to. Because consolidation is everything right now, Victor replied, and I could picture him perfectly even though I couldn't see him, standing by the window, probably, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of scotch he wouldn't actually drink. Always in control. Always 3 moves ahead. The Rossi family is aggressive, and they're well funded. Antonio Bellini controls half the Mediterranean routes. Marrying his daughter eliminates him as a potential ally to my enemies and gives me access to infrastructure I'd otherwise have to take by force. It's efficient. Efficient. The word lodged in my throat like a stone. I was efficient. A cost-saving measure. A hostile takeover executed with a wedding band instead of a bullet. She's easy on the eyes, at least, Dante offered, his voice carrying that particular inflection that made my skin crawl every time he looked at me. And young enough to give you a dynasty. I don't need beautiful, Victor said, cutting through Dante's observation like it was irrelevant noise. I need compliant. I need someone who understands that this life isn't negotiable and that my business stays my business. She's sheltered, Bruno. She grew up in her father's house reading art history books and planning a future that was never going to happen. She has no idea what she's walking into. The unfairness of it hit me like a physical blow. Sheltered. As if I hadn't watched my mother's light dim year by year under the weight of being married to a man like my father. As if I hadn't seen the wives at family gatherings, their smiles brittle and their eyes empty, performing contentment while their husbands conducted business that left blood on their hands and ghosts in their wake. I knew exactly what I was walking into. I'd been preparing to escape it my entire life. So what's the plan? Bruno pressed. After tonight? She takes the East Wing, Victor said, his tone administrative, final. Whatever rooms she wants, whatever staff she needs. As long as she stays out of my operations and fulfills her obligations, we won't have problems. I'll do what's required. Nothing more. Obligations. Fulfill. Required. The language of duty and contract, stripped of anything human, anything warm. I felt something inside me crack, not my heart but something deeper, the fragile architecture of hope that had kept me standing through the last 6 weeks of fittings and rehearsals and polite conversations with a man who looked at me like I was a balance sheet. I gathered my skirts and ran before I could hear anything else, before the tears burning behind my eyes could fall, before anyone could see the bride crumbling in the hallway. The powder room door closed behind me with a soft click, and I finally let myself breathe, staring at the stranger in the mirror wearing my face and my grandmother's veil. In 30 minutes, I would walk down that aisle. In 30 minutes, I would become Mrs. Victor Salvatore, a strategic ghost in a machine I would never understand, a wife who would never be wanted. The gilded prison was waiting. And I was out of time to run. The chapel doors opened and I heard the first notes of Wagner's bridal chorus like a death knell. Every head turned, 200 faces swiveling in perfect synchronization to watch me make the longest walk of my life. I kept my spine straight, my chin level, my expression carefully arranged into something that might pass for serene happiness if no one looked too closely at my eyes. My father's arm was solid beneath my gloved hand, steady and unyielding, a reminder that there was no escape route, no last-minute reprieve. This was happening whether I wanted it or not. The aisle stretched before me like a tunnel, narrow and suffocating despite the soaring ceilings and the cascading arrangements of white roses that must have cost more than most people earned in a year. I moved through it in a trance, my vision narrowing until all I could see was the altar and the man waiting there. Victor Salvatore, perfectly still, his hands clasped in front of him, his expression as unreadable as carved stone. He watched me approach with those winter-gray eyes, and I searched his face desperately for some flicker of warmth, some crack in the glacial control that might suggest he felt something, anything, beyond strategic satisfaction. There was nothing. Just assessment. Just the cool appraisal of a man inspecting an acquisition to ensure it met specifications. When my father placed my hand in Victor's, the exchange felt transactional, a transfer of property from one owner to another. Victor's fingers were cool and dry against mine, his grip firm but impersonal. He didn't smile. Didn't squeeze my hand in reassurance. Didn't offer any of the small gestures that might have made this moment feel less like a business closing. The priest began speaking in Italian, the old formal cadences rolling over me like water over stone. I heard myself responding at the appropriate moments, my voice steady despite the numbness spreading through my chest like frost. I repeated vows about honor and fidelity, about cherishing and commitment, and every word felt like a lie I was telling in front of God and 200 witnesses. Victor's responses were equally measured, equally empty. He could have been reading from a script, fulfilling a role he'd been assigned, checking boxes on a list of requirements. When the priest instructed him to kiss his bride, Victor leaned in with the mechanical precision of a man completing a task. His lips brushed mine, cool and brief, a formality observed rather than a promise sealed. The guests erupted in applause, the sound washing over us like a wave, and Victor's hand found the small of my back, proprietary and cold, as he turned us to face the crowd. I smiled because that's what brides do. I smiled as we walked back down the aisle together, as guests reached out to touch my dress or offer congratulations that sounded hollow in my ears. I smiled as we posed for photographs in the garden, Victor's arm around my waist, his body close but somehow still distant, 1,000 miles away despite the press of his shoulder against mine. The reception was held in the estate's grand ballroom, all Venetian chandeliers and imported marble, a monument to Salvatore wealth and power. I moved through it like a ghost, shaking hands and accepting kisses on both cheeks from relatives whose names I'd forgotten before they finished introducing themselves. Everyone wanted to congratulate the beautiful bride, to tell me how fortunate I was, how powerful my husband was, how this alliance would reshape the balance of power along the entire coast. No one mentioned love. No one asked if I was happy. They talked about territory and influence and the strategic brilliance of the match, as if I were a chess piece that had just been moved into position rather than a woman who had just sworn her life away. Victor barely spoke to me. He was always across the room, always in the center of a cluster of men in expensive suits, conducting business at our wedding reception like I was just another detail that had been handled. When he did approach, it was to introduce me to someone important, his hands settling at my waist with casual ownership, his tone polite but utterly impersonal. "My wife, Serafina," he would say, and the words sounded strange in his mouth, formal and foreign, like a title he was still getting used to wearing. Not "my beautiful wife," not "the woman I'm building a life with," just my name, stated as fact, attached to his possession. I danced with men whose faces blurred together, accepted toasts with champagne that tasted like nothing, listened to speeches about new beginnings that felt like endings. Through it all, the numbness spread deeper, a merciful anesthesia against the reality of what my life had become. As midnight approached, Victor's hand found my elbow, his touch light but commanding. "It's time," he said quietly, his voice betraying nothing, and I understood without him having to elaborate. Time to leave. Time to fulfill obligations. Time to begin the rest of my life in this gilded prison, married to a man who had never wanted me and never would. The guests cheered as we made our way toward the stairs, their voices ribald and knowing, making jokes about wedding nights and duty and the production of heirs. Victor's expression never changed. Neither did mine. We climbed the stairs together in silence, and with each step, I felt the door closing on whatever freedom I had left. The East Wing became my kingdom and my cage. 3 months passed like a slow hemorrhage, each day bleeding into the next with such monotonous precision that I sometimes lost track of whether it was Tuesday or Friday, March or April. The rooms Victor had given me were beautiful in the way museum exhibits are beautiful, pristine, expensive, utterly lifeless. Cream silk wallpaper, antique furniture that had probably cost more than a car, windows that overlooked manicured gardens I was never sure I was allowed to walk through. I filled the spaces with books I couldn't concentrate on and art supplies I rarely touched, trying to create some semblance of a life in rooms that felt like a very expensive waiting area. Victor lived in the West Wing, a geography that felt intentional, calculated to maximize distance while maintaining the appearance of cohabitation. I learned his patterns without ever speaking to him. He left at 7 each morning, his footsteps echoing through the marble hallways, always accompanied by Bruno or one of the other men whose names I'd stopped trying to remember. He returned at unpredictable hours, sometimes before dinner, sometimes well past midnight, smelling of cigar smoke and expensive cologne and something else I couldn't identify. Danger, maybe. Or just the weight of decisions I would never be privy to. We saw each other at dinner. Only at dinner. It was the one non-negotiable point of contact, enforced not by affection or even civility but by the need to maintain appearances before the household staff. 7 o'clock, every evening, in the formal dining room with its ridiculous 20-foot table and its crystal that caught the light from the chandelier like trapped stars. We sat at opposite ends, a vast expanse of polished mahogany between us, served by silent staff who had perfected the art of being invisible. The first few dinners, I'd tried. I'd asked about his day, commented on the weather, mentioned a book I was reading. Victor had responded with monosyllables, his attention fixed on his plate or his phone, making it abundantly clear that conversation was an intrusion rather than a courtesy. By the second week, I'd stopped trying. We ate in silence now, the only sounds the clink of silverware against porcelain and the soft footsteps of Maria, the housekeeper, as she brought courses and cleared plates with practiced efficiency. The tension was thick enough to choke on. I could feel it settling over the table like fog, could see it in the rigid set of Victor's shoulders, in the way his jaw tightened when our eyes accidentally met. He looked at me the same way he had at the altar, assessing, distant, making sure his acquisition was performing as expected. I was fed, clothed, housed. I had credit cards with no limits and staff who responded to my requests. I was being maintained like one of his luxury cars, kept in pristine condition but never actually driven anywhere. The only time he touched me was when duty demanded it. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times if he was home early enough, he would appear at my door after dinner. He never knocked, Just turned the handle and entered like he owned the space, which of course he did. The encounters were brief, clinical, executed with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything else. He would kiss me because apparently that was still required, his mouth cool and perfunctory against mine. His hands would move over my body with impersonal efficiency, and I would lie there feeling like a medical procedure, something to be completed and checked off a list. Produce and air within 18 months. I'd heard him say it. This was how he intended to fulfill that particular obligation. Afterward, he would leave without a word, returning to his wing of the house, and I would lie in the darkness feeling hollowed out and discarded. He never stayed. Never asked if I was all right. Never demonstrated even the bare minimum of concern for whether the experience had been pleasant or painful or utterly soul-destroying. I was a function to be performed, not a person to be considered. During the day, I was a ghost. I wandered the house trying to find purpose, trying to carve out some sense of self in a place that seemed designed to erase me. The staff were polite but distant, treating me with the careful deference reserved for someone whose position was unclear. I wasn't the lady of the house, not really. Victor made all the decisions, controlled all the operations, maintained all the power. I was an ornament, decorative but ultimately useless. I started taking longer walks through the gardens, testing the boundaries of my cage. Guards watched from discreet distances, never interfering but always present, a reminder that even my smallest movements were monitored. I tried painting in the conservatory, but every brushstroke felt like a performance, like I was playing at being a person with interests and interiority when really I was just filling time until the next silent dinner, the next clinical encounter, the next day of being a stranger in my own life. At night, alone in my beautiful prison, I sometimes wondered if this was all there would ever be. If I would spend the next 50 years living in parallel to a man who saw me as nothing more than a necessary inconvenience, a strategic acquisition that required minimal maintenance. The thought was unbearable, but so was the reality. I had nowhere to go, no way out, no future beyond these walls and this cold, careful distance. 3 months. It felt like 3 years. It felt like forever. I discovered the cameras in my 3rd week. Not because anyone told me, but because I'd been standing at the conservatory window watching rain streak down the glass and caught the faint red blink of a lens hidden in the crown molding. Once I knew what to look for, I found them everywhere, in the hallways, the library, the sitting rooms, even the gardens. Small, discreet, expensive. The only places without surveillance were the bedrooms and bathrooms, and even then I wasn't entirely certain. The thought of being watched while I read, while I painted, while I simply existed in my gilded cage made my skin crawl, but there was nothing I could do about it. This was Victor's house. Victor's world. I was just living in it. The guards were worse because they were human. Marco stationed himself at the end of the East Wing corridor every morning at 6, his expression professionally blank, his presence a constant reminder that I couldn't leave without being tracked. Giovanni shadowed me on my garden walks, maintaining a careful 20 feet of distance but never letting me out of his sight. When I went to the library, when I took tea in the morning room, when I did anything at all outside my immediate quarters, there was always someone watching. Always someone reporting back. At first I thought it was standard security protocol, the kind of protection that came with being married to a man like Victor Salvatore. But by the 2nd month, I began to notice patterns that felt less like protection and more like surveillance. The guards changed shifts precisely when I changed locations, as if my movements were being coordinated from some central command. If I deviated from my usual routine, if I explored a hallway I hadn't walked before or spent longer than usual in the music room, I would see Marco or Giovanni or one of the others speaking quietly into their phones, reporting my activities to someone who cared enough to track them. I was a prisoner. The realization settled over me like a weighted blanket, suffocating and inescapable. I had more money at my disposal than I'd ever had in my life, access to anything material I could want, and yet I couldn't take a walk without being monitored, couldn't read a book without wondering if someone was watching me turn the pages. But then I started noticing something else. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cameras or the guards. Victor was watching me. Not through the surveillance feeds, though I was certain he reviewed those. Actually watching me, in person, from the shadows. I would feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing and look up to find him standing in a doorway I hadn't heard him enter, his expression unreadable, his winter-gray eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He never approached. Never spoke. Just watched for a moment or two before turning and disappearing as silently as he'd arrived. The first time it happened, I was in the library, curled into one of the leather armchairs with a book on Caravaggio I couldn't focus on. I felt the shift in the air, that peculiar electricity that comes with being observed, and when I looked up he was there. Standing in the doorway, one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed over his chest. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he looked tired in a way I'd never seen him look before. Vulnerable, almost. Human. Our eyes met and held. 5 seconds. 10. Long enough that I felt my pulse quicken, felt something twist low in my stomach that I didn't want to examine too closely. Then he straightened and walked away without a word, leaving me with my book and my racing heart and 1,000 questions I had no way to answer. It kept happening. I would be painting in the conservatory and catch a glimpse of him watching from the terrace, his hands in his pockets, his expression shuttered but his attention absolute. I would be having breakfast in the morning room and feel that telltale shift in the atmosphere, look up to find him standing in the hall just beyond the doorway, coffee cup in hand, eyes tracking my movements like I was something that required study. Once, I was walking in the garden at dusk, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine, and I turned to find him standing on the balcony of the west wing, 3 stories up. Even from that distance I could feel the weight of his stare, could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the balustrade like he was holding himself back from something. When I lifted my hand in a tentative wave, he turned and disappeared into the house. The watching wasn't casual. It wasn't the disinterested monitoring of security footage or the clinical assessment I'd grown used to at dinner. This was something else entirely. Something intense and focused and almost hungry, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't understand, trying to categorize something that refused to fit into his carefully ordered world. It should have frightened me. The attention of a man like Victor Salvatore, a man who controlled territory and commanded fear, a man who had married me for strategic advantage and treated me like a necessary inconvenience, that attention should have felt threatening. Instead, it felt like the first real thing that had happened between us since the wedding. Like maybe, beneath all the distance and the silence and the careful control, there was something alive. Something that saw me not as an acquisition or an obligation, but as a person worth watching. I started watching back. The invitation arrived on thick cream cardstock, delivered by courier on a Tuesday morning in late April. Julia Romano was hosting a charity luncheon at her family's villa, a fundraiser for the children's hospital that attracted the wives and daughters of every major family in the region. My presence was requested. Expected, really, since refusing would raise questions about the state of my marriage, about whether I was being kept isolated, about whether the Bellini-Salvatore alliance was as solid as it appeared. I mentioned it to Victor at dinner that evening, sliding the invitation across the expanse of mahogany table between us. He picked it up, scanned it with those calculating gray eyes, and set it down without comment. "I'd like to go," I said, my voice sounding strange in the silence we'd perfected over 3 months. "If that's acceptable." His gaze lifted to mine, sharp and assessing. "You'll take Marco and Giovanni. They stay within sight at all times. You leave when they tell you to leave. Not, 'have a nice time,' or 'I hope you enjoy yourself.' Just parameters and security protocols." I nodded, taking what I could get, which was at least permission to leave the estate for a few hours. The Romano villa was beautiful in that ostentatious way that old money families cultivated, all marble columns and manicured topiary and servers in white jackets circulating with champagne and tiny, architecturally ambitious canapes. I arrived fashionably late, dressed in a pale blue dress that had appeared in my closet courtesy of whatever personal shopper Victor employed to keep me appropriately outfitted. The other women greeted me with air kisses and carefully modulated enthusiasm, their eyes assessing my jewelry, my dress, the state of my marriage as reflected in my face. Julia pulled me aside within minutes, linking her arm through mine. "You look thin," she said bluntly. "Is he feeding you?" "He's feeding me," I assured her, though the truth was I'd lost weight from stress and loneliness and the soul-crushing monotony of my new life. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You look like a ghost." She steered me toward the gardens, away from the cluster of women dissecting the latest society scandal. "How bad is it?" Before I could answer, a woman appeared at my other elbow, beautiful in that polished way that required professional maintenance. Late 30s, dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, diamonds at her throat that caught the afternoon light. Her smile was warm but her eyes were calculating. "Serafina Salvatore," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Valentina Marchesi. I've been hoping to meet you." I shook her hand, feeling Julia tense beside me. The Marchesi family ran legitimate businesses on the surface, restaurants, hotels, import-export operations, but everyone knew they had connections to the Rossi family. They were in the gray area, respectable enough to attend charity luncheons but ruthless enough to profit from the violence they publicly condemned. "It's nice to meet you," I said carefully. "Your husband has quite a reputation," Valentina continued, her tone conversational but her attention absolute. "Although I have to say, I'm surprised to see you here. I heard he keeps you very protected." There was something beneath the words, some implication I couldn't quite parse. Julia's grip on my arm tightened in warning. "Victor is concerned about my safety," I said neutrally. "Given the current climate." "Of course." Valentina's smile widened. "It must be difficult, being married to a man with so many enemies. Especially when those enemies might see you as a way to hurt him." The words landed like ice water down my spine. Marco had materialized several feet away, his hand resting casually near his jacket where I knew he kept his weapon. Giovanni was scanning the crowd with professional paranoia. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," I said, but my voice came out thinner than I intended. Valentina leaned in slightly, her perfume expensive and cloying. "Victor Salvatore is known for being untouchable. No weaknesses, no soft spots, nothing that can be leveraged against him. But everyone has something they care about, don't they? And from what I hear, despite his very public indifference, you might be the only thing that could make him vulnerable." The threat was clear even though she never raised her voice, never lost her pleasant expression. She was telling me that I was a target. That Victor's enemies had identified me as the crack in his armor, the weak point they could exploit. "My husband doesn't have soft spots," I said, the words bitter in my mouth because they were true. "I'm a strategic acquisition, nothing more. Hurting me wouldn't accomplish anything except making him angry, and I don't think you want that." Something flickered in Valentina's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. "Perhaps," she said softly. "Or perhaps he's better at hiding what matters than anyone realizes." Marco was moving toward us now, his expression professionally blank but his intention clear. "Time to leave." "It was lovely meeting you," Valentina said, stepping back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure we'll see each other again." Julia pulled me away, her fingers digging into my arm hard enough to bruise. "What the hell was that?" "A warning," I said, my mind racing. "They think I'm Victor's weakness." "Are you?" I thought about the distance between us, the clinical encounters, the silent dinners, the way he watched me from the shadows with that intensity one couldn't interpret. "No," I said finally. He doesn't care enough for me to be a weakness. But even as I said it, I remembered the weight of his stare, the way his hands had gripped the balcony railing like he was holding himself back. The way he tracked my movements through his house like I was something that required constant monitoring. Maybe Valentino was right. Maybe Victor's enemies saw something I couldn't see, something he was hiding even from himself. And if they believed I mattered to him, if they thought hurting me would hurt him, then I was in more danger than I'd realized. Marco escorted me to the car, his hand hovering near his weapon, his eyes scanning every face in the crowd. As we drove back to the estate, back to my gilded prison, I realized the cage wasn't just about control. It was about protection. And I had no idea whether that made things better or infinitely worse. The gala was supposed to be neutral ground. The annual spring fundraiser at the Grand Hotel Palazzo, attended by every major family in the region, was one of the few events where old rivalries were set aside in favor of champagne and the performance of civility. Victor had informed me at dinner 3 nights prior that my attendance was required, that we would be presenting a united front, that I should wear something appropriate. A black velvet gown had appeared in my closet the next morning, accompanied by diamonds I was certain cost more than a house. We arrived separately, of course. Victor came with Bruno and Dante, discussing business in the car while I rode in the second vehicle with Marco and Giovanni, a living metaphor for our marriage. But once inside, Victor's hand found the small of my back with that familiar proprietary touch, guiding me through the crowd of people who wanted his attention, his favor, his alliance. I smiled and nodded and played my part, the beautiful accessory on the arm of the most dangerous man in the room. The ballroom was magnificent, all crystal chandeliers and gilded molding and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city lights. Servers circulated with champagne and delicacies I couldn't identify. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner. Everyone was dressed in their finest, dripping with wealth and barely concealed violence, performing sophistication while conducting the kind of business that left bodies in shallow graves. Victor left me with a cluster of wives after 20 minutes, disappearing into a private room with several other men whose names carried weight. I nursed a glass of champagne I didn't want and made small talk I didn't care about, counting the minutes until I could return to my cage. The first gunshot sounded like a champagne cork, distant and almost festive. The second one shattered that illusion along with one of the massive windows. Then there was screaming, and the orderly elegance of the gala dissolved into chaos. People were running, shoving, diving behind overturned tables. More gunshots, coming from multiple directions, the sharp crack of pistols mixing with the deeper boom of something heavier. Glass exploded inward as another window shattered, and I saw figures in black moving through the confusion, their faces covered, their weapons raised. Marco grabbed my arm, yanking me down behind a marble column as bullets chewed through the air where I'd been standing. "Stay down," he barked, his weapon already drawn, returning fire at shadows I couldn't track. The world had narrowed to survival instinct and adrenaline. I pressed myself against the cold marble, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, my ears ringing from the concussive force of gunfire in an enclosed space. People were screaming, crying, dying. I could see bodies on the floor, could see blood spreading across the pristine white marble like spilled wine. Someone was shouting orders in a language I didn't recognize. More gunfire. The chandeliers swayed dangerously overhead, crystal pendants tinkling like wind chimes in hell. Then I heard Victor's voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Where is she?" Not "secure the perimeter" or "neutralize the threat." Where is she? I tried to stand, to call out to him, but Marco shoved me back down with enough force to bruise. "Stay down, Mrs. Salvatore. He'll kill me if anything happens to you." But I could hear Victor now, closer, his voice stripped of its usual control. "Serafina." Not my name spoken with cool formality over dinner, but something raw and desperate, edged with fear I'd never heard from him before. "I'm here." I shouted, and Marco cursed but didn't stop me. Victor appeared through the smoke and chaos like an avenging angel, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt splattered with blood that might have been his or someone else's. His face was a mask of lethal focus, his weapon raised, his eyes scanning the destruction until they found me. The relief that crossed his features lasted maybe half a second before the mask slammed back down, but I saw it. I saw the fear, the desperation, the absolute terror that something might have happened to me. He crossed the distance between us in 3 strides, hauling me up by my arms and pulling me against his chest with enough force to knock the breath from my lungs. His hand came up to cradle the back of my head, his other arm banding around my waist like he was trying to absorb me into his body, to shield me with his own flesh. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, barely controlled. "Serafina, are you hurt?" "No, I'm..." More gunfire. Victor spun, putting his body between me and the threat, returning fire with deadly precision. 2 attackers dropped. He was moving before they hit the ground, dragging me with him toward the emergency exit, Bruno and Giovanni materializing to provide cover. We burst into the service hallway, the sounds of battle muffled by thick walls. Victor didn't slow down, didn't let go of me, his grip on my wrist almost painful as he pulled me through a maze of corridors I couldn't track. "Victor, what?" "Not now." His voice was clipped, absolute. We reached a service entrance where a black SUV was already waiting, engine running. He practically threw me into the back seat, climbing in after me and slamming the door. "Drive. Now." The vehicle lurched forward and Victor finally released me, but only long enough to run his hands over my arms, my face, checking for injuries with shaking fingers that betrayed the control he was trying to project. "You're bleeding," I said, noticing the gash above his eyebrow, the way his shirt was torn and dark with blood. "It's not mine." He cupped my face in both hands, forcing me to meet his eyes. The winter gray had thawed into something molten, something fierce and possessive and terrified. "You could have died. Do you understand that? They were targeting you." "How do you?" "Because I would do the same thing." His thumb brushed across my cheekbone, almost gentle despite the violence still thrumming through him. "If I wanted to destroy someone, I'd take what matters most to them." The words hung between us, heavy with implications neither of us was ready to examine. His mask had cracked wide open, and I was seeing something underneath I didn't understand, something that looked dangerously close to caring. "You said I was just an acquisition," I whispered. His jaw tightened. I lied. The safe house was 40 minutes outside the city, buried in the hills where the roads turned to gravel and civilization thinned to scattered villas behind high walls. It was smaller than the estate, more fortress than home, with reinforced doors and security systems that Bruno activated the moment we arrived. Victor hadn't spoken during the drive, his jaw locked tight, his hands still wrapped around mine like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. Bruno cleared the rooms with military efficiency while Giovanni secured the perimeter. Victor pulled me inside, his movements sharp and controlled despite the blood on his clothes and the wild edge I could see in his eyes. He locked the door behind us with a finality that made my breath catch. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough. "No one knows about this location except my most trusted men." I stood in the center of the sparsely furnished living room, still wearing the black velvet gown now torn at the hem and spotted with champagne and someone else's blood. My hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had carried me through the attack was draining away, leaving me hollow and unsteady. "Victor." My voice came out smaller than I intended. "What's happening?" He turned to face me, and I saw the moment his control finally shattered. His hands came up to his hair, fingers digging in like he wanted to tear something apart. "They tried to kill you. Right in front of me, in a room full of witnesses, they tried to take you. But why? I'm nothing to you. You said." "I know what I said." He crossed the distance between us in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that contradicted the violence still coiled in his body. I know exactly what I said, and I've regretted it every day since you overheard it. The world tilted. You knew? Marco told me you were in the hallway. That you heard everything. His thumbs brushed across my cheekbones, his touch reverent despite the tremor in his fingers. I saw it in your eyes when you walked down that aisle. You looked at me like I was your executioner. You were. The words came out broken. You are. I know. His forehead dropped to mine, his breath warm against my lips. God, Serafina, I know. But I couldn't, I didn't know how to. He pulled back, his hands falling away as he turned and paced toward the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. Do you understand what you are? What you've been since the moment I saw you? An acquisition. A strategic necessity. A means to. A weakness. The word came out like a confession torn from somewhere deep. The only weakness I've ever had. I stared at his back, at the blood-stained shirt pulled tight across his shoulders, trying to process what he was saying. That doesn't make sense. You've barely looked at me in 3 months. He laughed, the sound bitter and self-deprecating. I've done nothing but look at you. Every camera feed, every report from the guards, every moment you thought you were alone. He turned back to face me, and the rawness in his expression stole my breath. I watched you paint in the conservatory. I watched you read in the library. I stood outside your door at night and listened to you cry and hated myself for being the reason. Then why? My voice broke. Why the distance? Why the cold dinners and the separate wings and treating me like I was something you couldn't wait to be rid of? Because I'm terrified of you. The admission seemed to cost him something. I've built an empire on control, Serafina. I control my territory, my men, my enemies, myself. I've never let anything compromise that control because the moment I do, the moment I show weakness, I'm dead. We're all dead. He moved toward me again, slower this time, like he was approaching something fragile. And then your father offered you as part of the alliance, and I saw your photograph, and I knew. I knew before I ever met you that you were going to destroy me. I haven't done anything, I whispered. You exist. His hands found my waist, pulling me close enough that I could feel the heat of him through my ruined dress. You walk through my house and you make it feel like a home instead of a fortress. You look at me across that ridiculous dinner table and I forget what I was thinking about. You smile at something in your book and I want to know what made you happy so I can give you more of it. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, his touch achingly gentle. I told myself the distance was necessary. That if I kept you at arm's length, if I never let myself feel what I was feeling, I could control it. I could have the alliance without the vulnerability. The strategic advantage without the weakness. But it didn't work, I said, understanding beginning to dawn. No. His laugh was hollow. It made everything worse. Because every night I spent alone in that other wing, I was thinking about you. Every cold dinner was torture. Every time I had to touch you like you were an obligation when all I wanted was to. He stopped himself, his jaw working. And then tonight, when I heard those gunshots and I didn't know where you were, I realized that all the distance in the world wouldn't change the fundamental truth. What truth? His eyes met mine, winter gray turned molten with everything he'd been holding back. That I would burn this entire city to the ground to keep you safe. That losing you would destroy me more effectively than any rival ever could. That I don't want her was the biggest lie I've ever told, because I've wanted you since the moment I saw you, and it terrifies me more than anything I've ever faced. I reached up, my fingers trembling as they traced the cut above his eyebrow. You should have told me. I couldn't. Because men like me don't get to want things, Serafina. We take what we need and we protect what we have and we never, ever admit to weakness. But you, his voice cracked. You're not just a weakness. You're the thing that could unmake me completely. And I didn't know how to handle that except to push you away and hope the feeling would fade. Did it? I asked, barely breathing. Fade? No. He pulled me closer, eliminating the last inch of space between us. It got stronger every single day. And now they know. My enemies know that you matter, that you're the crack in my armor, and I can't protect you by pretending anymore. So what do we do? His hands tightened on my waist, possessive and desperate. We stop lying. We stop pretending this is just business. And we figure out how to survive what's coming, together. Then he kissed me, and it was nothing like the clinical touches I'd endured for 3 months. This was desperation and need, and 3 months of wanting wrapped into something that felt like falling and flying at the same time. When we finally broke apart, his forehead resting against mine, I whispered the truth I'd been afraid to admit even to myself. I heard what you said that day. And I married you anyway, hoping you were wrong about not wanting me. I was, he said fiercely. God, Serafina, I was so wrong. The morning light filtered through the safe house windows, pale and unforgiving. I woke on the sofa, wrapped in Victor's suit jacket, his arm heavy across my waist where he'd fallen asleep beside me sometime after dawn. We'd spent the night talking, peeling back layers of misunderstanding and fear, and now in the cold clarity of daylight I had to decide what came next. Victor stirred, his eyes opening to find me already awake. For a moment we just looked at each other, and I saw the uncertainty there, the fear that last night's confessions might evaporate in the morning light like a fever dream. We need to talk, I said, and watched his expression shudder, the mask trying to slide back into place. Serafina. No. I sat up, pushing his arm away gently but firmly. You got to say everything you needed to say last night. Now it's my turn. He sat up slowly, wary, that careful control reasserting itself even as his hair stood up in directions that would have been endearing if we weren't about to have the conversation that would determine the rest of our lives. I'm not going back to the East Wing, I said, and watched his eyes widen slightly. I'm not going back to silent dinners and separate lives and pretending we're strangers who happen to share a last name. If what you said last night was true, if I actually matter to you, then things change. All of it changes. What are you asking for? His voice was careful, measured. I'm not asking. I stood, needing the advantage of height even though he still towered over me when he rose to his feet. I'm telling you the terms of our new arrangement. Because you were right about one thing, your enemies see me as your weakness. But that's only true if I'm kept ignorant and helpless, a pretty target you've locked away in a tower. You're not helpless. No, I'm not. But I've been playing the role you assigned me. The decorative wife who doesn't ask questions, who doesn't know anything about your business, who can't protect herself or you because she's been deliberately kept in the dark. I crossed my arms, channeling every ounce of strength I'd inherited from my mother, who had survived 30 years in this world. That ends now. Victor's jaw tightened. It's dangerous. The less you know. The less I know, the more vulnerable I am. They attacked last night because they think I'm your soft spot, your blind spot, the weakness they can exploit. And they're right, as long as I'm nothing but a civilian casualty waiting to happen. I moved closer, refusing to let him intimidate me with his height or his reputation or the violence he was capable of. But if I know what's happening, if I understand the players and the politics and the threats, I can protect myself. I can protect you. You want me to bring you into the business. It wasn't a question. I want you to stop treating me like I'm made of glass. I grew up in this world, Victor. My father ran operations out of our dining room. I've been listening to coded conversations and reading between lines since I was old enough to understand that some questions don't get asked out loud. I held his gaze, refusing to back down. You married me for the alliance. For the ports and the routes and the strategic advantage. So let me be strategic. Let me be useful for something other than producing heirs and looking appropriate at galas. Something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe. Or fear of a different kind, the fear of letting someone in, of sharing the burden he'd carried alone for so long. And if I say no? He asked quietly. If I say I want to keep you separate from that part of my life? Then you're lying again. Because you can't keep me separate. Your enemies already know I matter. The only question is whether I face what's coming as a partner who understands the game, or as a pawn who doesn't even know she's on the board. The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. I could see him thinking, calculating, weighing the risks against the reality that everything had already changed. I won't be locked away anymore, I continued, pressing my advantage. I won't live in a cage while you pretend it's for my protection. If we're doing this, if we're actually building something real instead of performing a strategic alliance, then I need to know what I'm part of. The truth, Victor. All of it. The business, the threats, the decisions that put targets on our backs. It's not pretty, he warned. The things I do, the choices I have to make. I'm not asking for pretty. I'm asking for real. I reached out, my hand finding his chest where his heart beat steady beneath blood-stained cotton. You said I was your weakness. But I could be your strength instead. Let me. He caught my wrist, his thumb pressing against my pulse point. You don't know what you're asking for. Yes, I do. I'm asking to be your wife in every sense. Not the decorative one you present at galas, not the strategic acquisition you keep at a distance, not the obligation you fulfill twice a week like a business meeting. I stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of him. I'm asking to be your partner. Your equal. Someone you trust with the truth instead of hiding behind protection and surveillance and distance. Partners share everything, he said slowly. The danger, the decisions, the weight of what we do. Yes. You could get hurt. Killed. Used against me in ways that's already true. At least this way I'll see it coming. I pulled my wrist free and placed both palms flat against his chest. You can't protect me by keeping me ignorant, Victor. You can only protect me by making me strong enough to stand beside you. He was silent for a long moment, his hands coming up to cover mine, his eyes searching my face like he was looking for cracks, for signs that I didn't understand what I was volunteering for. No more separate wings, he said finally. No more separate lives. You come to the strategy meetings. You learn the operations, the players, the threats. And you stop treating me like I'll break if you tell me the truth. His hand slid up to cup my face, tilting it up toward his. This isn't salvation, Serafina. What I'm offering you isn't rescue or safety or some fairy tale where love conquers all. I know. I met his gaze steadily. But it's real. And real is what I've needed from you since the beginning. Then we do this my way, he said, his voice dropping to something almost dangerous. You want to be my partner? You follow my lead until you understand how this world works. You learn before you act. You trust me to teach you how to survive it. As long as you trust me to learn. Something in his expression softened, just for a moment. I'm going to fail you. I'm going to make decisions you disagree with. I'm going to be ruthless and cold and human, I interrupted. You're going to be human. Flawed and complicated and sometimes wrong. I can handle that. Can you handle me doing the same? The ghost of a smile crossed his face. I don't have a choice anymore, do I? You've already decided. Yes. I have. He kissed me then, sealing the new terms of our arrangement, and when we broke apart he rested his forehead against mine. "Welcome to the war, Mrs. Salvatore," he murmured. "I hope you're ready." "I've been ready since you said you didn't want me," I whispered back. "I've just been waiting for you to realize you were wrong." His laugh was soft and genuine. "I'm beginning to think you might actually save me after all." "Not save you," I corrected. "Stand with you. There's a difference." "Yes," he agreed. "There is." And for the first time since our wedding day, I believed we might actually survive this. We returned to the estate 3 days after the attack, and I walked through the front doors not as a prisoner returning to her cage but as something else entirely. Something dangerous. Victor's hand rested at the small of my back, possessive but no longer cold, and when the household staff assembled in the foyer their eyes widened at the sight of us together, the distance between us finally, visibly closed. "Mrs. Salvatore will be joining the senior staff meetings," Victor announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "She has full access to all operational briefings. Anyone who questions this answers to me directly." Bruno's expression flickered with something that might have been concern or approval, impossible to tell. Dante looked like he'd swallowed glass. But no one objected, because no one questioned Victor Salvatore and lived to regret it. The war room was in the basement, a space I'd never been allowed to enter. Concrete walls, reinforced doors, a massive table covered in maps and photographs and documents marked with red ink. This was where Victor's empire was managed, where strategy was determined and violence was coordinated with clinical precision. I stood at that table and studied the landscape of our enemies. The Rossi family controlled the northern ports. The Marchesi family, Valentina's family, operated in the gray zones, feeding information to whoever paid best. Smaller operations circled like sharks, waiting for weakness, for an opening to strike. The attack at the gala was coordinated, Victor explained, his finger tracing movements on the map. 3 entry points, professional shooters, targeting you specifically while keeping me occupied in the private rooms. His jaw tightened. They knew where you'd be. They knew my schedule. They knew too much. "Inside information," I said, and felt the room's attention shift to me. "Yes." Victor's eyes met mine. "Which means someone close is feeding intelligence to the Rossis." Over the next 3 days, I absorbed everything. The shipping routes and the protection schemes, the legitimate businesses that laundered money and the offshore accounts that kept it hidden. I learned the names of Victor's captains and their territories, learned which alliances were solid and which were held together with nothing but mutual fear. And I watched. I watched the men who came and went from the estate, watched how they interacted with Victor, watched their eyes when they thought no one was paying attention. On the 4th day, during a strategy meeting about reinforcing our coastal operations, I saw it. The smallest flicker of reaction when Victor mentioned moving a shipment through the Genoa docks, my family's territory, the ports that had come to him through our marriage. Dante's eyes had cut to Bruno, just for a second, just long enough for something to pass between them that didn't belong. I stayed silent through the rest of the meeting, but when it ended and the others filed out, I caught Victor's arm. "It's Dante," I said quietly. His expression went very still. "What?" "Your cousin. He's the leak." I pulled him back to the table, to the maps and schedules laid out like a tactical grid. "Watch him tomorrow. When you discuss the southern expansion, mention routing through Sicily instead of Sardinia. See what happens." "Serafina, that's a serious accusation." "I know." I met his gaze steadily. "But I've been watching him watch you for 3 months. He looks at you like he's measuring you for a coffin. And when you mentioned Genoa today, he looked at Bruno like he was confirming something they'd already discussed." Victor was silent, his mind working through possibilities and implications. "If you're right. Then he's been feeding our movements to the Rossis, probably hoping they'd kill you and he'd inherit control." I traced the map with one finger. He's always resented you. I could see it at the wedding, the way he looked at me like I was something he deserved more than you did. He thinks he should be sitting in your chair. And if you're wrong? Then I've just destroyed my credibility in your organization and you can go back to keeping me locked in the East Wing. I straightened. But I'm not wrong. The next day's meeting was a performance. Victor laid out plans for expanding through Sicily, detailed routes and timelines and shipment schedules. I watched Dante from across the table, watched his fingers drum against his phone, watched him excuse himself halfway through to take a call he claimed was urgent. Bruno followed him. Not obviously, but I saw him leave 30 seconds later, saw the grim set to his expression. They returned 10 minutes later. Bruno's hand rested on Dante's shoulder, almost friendly, but I saw the tightness around Dante's eyes, saw the way his movements had gone careful and controlled. Victor continued the meeting like nothing had happened, but when it ended he dismissed everyone except Bruno, Dante, and me. "Close the door," Victor said quietly. Bruno obeyed, and the sound of the lock engaging echoed like a gunshot. "Dante." Victor's voice was soft, almost gentle. "How long have you been talking to the Rossis?" The room went very still. Dante's face drained of color, then flushed red with rage and fear. "I don't know what." "Bruno intercepted your call," Victor continued, still in that terribly gentle voice. "You were confirming the Sicily route. Telling them where to position their people to intercept the shipment." He stood slowly, and the violence coiled in his movements made the air feel thin. "My own blood, selling me out for what? A promise of territory? A bigger cut? You don't deserve it," Dante spat, his composure shattering. "You inherited everything because you were born first, but I've worked just as hard, sacrificed just as much. You tried to have my wife killed." Victor's control was absolute, which made him infinitely more terrifying. "At the gala. You told them where she'd be." The confirmation was written all over Dante's face, the guilt and defiance warring in his expression. Victor looked at me, and I saw the question there. This was my discovery, my accusation. He was giving me the choice. "He betrayed you," I said clearly. "He put a target on both our backs. That can't stand." Victor nodded once, then turned back to Dante. "You're right about one thing. You have sacrificed. Just not enough yet." What happened next was brutal and efficient, the kind of violence I'd known existed in Victor's world but had never witnessed firsthand. Bruno dragged Dante from the room, and I heard the screaming start as they descended to whatever place Victor kept for dealing with traitors. I didn't flinch. Didn't look away when Victor turned back to me, blood on his knuckles, something dark and satisfied in his eyes. "You were right," he said. "I know." He crossed to me, cupping my face in hands that still carried the evidence of violence. "They'll know now. Everyone will know that you're not just my wife. You're my partner. That makes you even more of a target." "Good," I said fiercely. "Let them come. At least now I'll be ready." His kiss tasted like pride and possession and the beginning of something that looked dangerously like trust. The week of Red had begun, and I was no longer its potential victim. I was its architect. 3 years later, I stood in the conservatory watching spring rain streak down the glass, my hand resting on the swell of my belly where our daughter kicked and turned with the restless energy she'd inherited from her father. The room had changed since those early days when I'd painted here alone, trying to fill the hollow ache of isolation. Now it was alive with color. My canvases lined the walls, some finished, some still in progress, capturing moments of the life we'd built from the wreckage of our beginning. Victor found me there, as he always did, moving through the house with that predatory grace that still made my breath catch even after 3 years of marriage. But now when he approached, there was no distance, no careful control holding him back. His arms came around me from behind, his hands settling over mine on our daughter's temporary home, his chin resting on my shoulder. "She's active today," he murmured, feeling the flutter of movement beneath our joined palms. "She gets that from you. Never still, always plotting her next move." I leaned back into his warmth, into the solid reality of him. "Bruno says the Genoa shipment arrived without incident. The new routes are holding. You've been reading the reports again." His voice carried fond exasperation. "You're supposed to be resting. I'm pregnant, not incapacitated. And someone needs to make sure you're not starting wars while I'm busy growing a human." I turned in his arms, studying the face that had once seemed carved from marble and now showed the subtle softening that came with something dangerously close to happiness. Besides, the Marchesi family has been quiet too long. Valentina doesn't just disappear unless she's planning something. Later. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, my nose, finally my lips. "Right now, I want to show you something." He led me through halls that no longer felt like a labyrinth designed to trap me but like home, our home, built not from the cold strategic alliance we'd started with but from the thousand small choices we'd made to stop being strangers. Past the formal dining room where we no longer sat at opposite ends of that ridiculous table but close enough to touch, past the library where we'd spent countless nights planning operations and arguing strategy, up the stairs to the wing that used to be mine alone but had become ours the day I'd refused to go back to living separately. In what would be our daughter's nursery, Victor had assembled a crib. Not hired someone to do it, actually built it himself, his hands more accustomed to weapons than woodwork, but determined nonetheless. It stood near the window, painted a soft cream, hand-carved with a pattern of climbing roses that must have taken him weeks. "Victor." My voice caught on his name. "When did you?" "Late at night. When you were sleeping and I couldn't." He ran his hand along the smooth wood, almost shy, this man who commanded fear and respect from the most dangerous people in our world. "I wanted her to have something I made. Something that didn't come from violence or money or power. Just me." I crossed to him, my fingers tracing the delicate roses he'd carved with such care. "It's perfect." "You say that now. Wait until she's 16 and bringing home boys I'll have to threaten." His attempt at levity couldn't quite hide the vulnerability underneath, the fear that still caught him sometimes that he didn't know how to be anything but the monster his world had required. I took his face in my hands, making him look at me. "You're going to be an incredible father. Just like you became an incredible husband once you stopped being terrified of what that meant." "I'm still terrified." His hands settled on my hips, his forehead dropping to rest against mine. "Every day I'm terrified that I'll fail you. That I'll fail her. That this," he gestured at the nursery, "at the life we'd built, is too fragile to survive in our world. Then we make it strong enough to survive." I kissed him softly. "We teach her to be smart and fierce and how to see the cracks in people's armor. We teach her that love doesn't make you weak, it makes you willing to burn the world down to protect what matters." His laugh was soft against my lips. "That's a terrifying thought. A daughter with your intelligence and my ruthlessness. She'll be unstoppable." We stood there in the gathering dusk, in a room designed for hope and future and all the things we'd both thought were impossible on that cold February day when I'd stood in a hallway and heard him say he didn't want me. The mansion sprawled around us, no longer a gilded prison but a fortress we defended together, filled with the strange alchemy of violence and tenderness that defined our life. "Do you ever think about it?" I asked quietly. "That day. What you said. Every time I look at you." His arms tightened around me. "Every time I remember what I almost destroyed because I was too afraid to admit what you'd become to me." What had I become? Everything. The word was simple, absolute. My weakness and my strength. My greatest vulnerability and the only thing that makes any of this worth surviving. His hand moved to my belly again, to where our daughter was growing, the physical proof of what we'd built from ashes and necessity. You saved me, Serafina. From the monster I was becoming. From the isolation I thought was strength. You saved me too, I whispered. From being nothing but a decorative ghost. From accepting that survival was the best I could hope for. I pulled back enough to see his face, to trace the lines that worry and responsibility had carved there. We saved each other by choosing to be human. By choosing to be real instead of the roles we were supposed to play. He kissed me then, deep and slow and full of everything we'd fought for, and when we finally broke apart the rain had stopped and the last light was painting the nursery gold. She's going to ask someday, Victor said. How we fell in love. What she should tell people about her parents. We'll tell her the truth. I laced my fingers through his. That we married as strangers and enemies. That we spent months as captives in a prison of our own making. That we almost destroyed each other before we figured out how to be partners. That's not exactly a fairy tale. No. I smiled up at him. It's better. It's real. Our daughter kicked hard, as if in agreement, and we both laughed at her timing, at the impossible miracle of her existence born from the wreckage of our beginning. The mansion was quiet around us, filled with guards and staff and the subtle machinery of the empire we ran together. Outside these walls, enemies still circled and threats still evolved and the violence of our world continued its relentless churn. But here, in this room built for hope, we were just Victor and Serafina, two people who had chosen to save each other by refusing to be anything less than completely, messily, dangerously human. I love you, he said, the words still new enough to carry weight, still rare enough to matter. I know, I replied, my hand finding his over our daughter's restless movements. You show me every day. And in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the life we'd fought and bled and chosen to build, I realized that salvation had never been about rescue or redemption. It had been about two people deciding that the monster and the captive could become something else entirely. Something worth fighting for. Something that looked, against all odds and logic and expectation, remarkably like home.